Good evening, I'm Mike Knetter, and welcome to the UW Now Livestream series. A year ago, we did a program on Europe's growing dependence on Russian energy in its transition to greener options. Today, geopolitical and military conflicts, as well as environmental threats, appear directly related to petrostate fossil fuel dependence. The stakes are high for a transition to alternative forms of energy that are more sustainable, accessible, and environmentally friendly. What are the leading alternatives, and can they scale adequately? How long will the transition take? And what role does energy storage play in the equation? Can we increase the resilience of our electricity grid? I've got three UW experts with us tonight to talk about these and other topics and share a bit with you about how the university's researchers are helping make advances to improve society. Tim Donahue is the Ira Baldwin Professor of Bacteriology, the UW Foundation Fetzer Bascom Professor, and the Director of the Wisconsin Energy Institute. Lena Roald is an Assistant Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering and a Granger Institute Fellow. And leading us off tonight is Greg Nemet, a professor at UW-Madison's La Follette School of Public Affairs. Thank you all for joining us on this Tuesday evening in Wisconsin. I know you're going to be late to watching the Badgers take on UW Green Bay, and I apologize, but our audience is pretty excited to hear about the future of energy. So let's begin. Greg Nemet's research focuses on understanding how public policy affects the process of technological change. His first book, How Solar Became Cheap, was published in 2019. Among other things, he teaches about energy systems analysis and international environmental policy. He has chaired the UW's Energy Analysis and Policy Program, received a prestigious Romnus Faculty Fellowship, and was named an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. He was also awarded the inaugural World Citizen Prize in Environmental Performance by the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management in 2019. He's currently a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Sixth Assessment Report. Greg, you've kept very busy, as we can tell, with all this work, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share some of your insights with our audience tonight. Please take it away.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction, Mike. And I have been really busy because there's a lot going on in energy. And the way I would sum it up, all these dynamics, is that energy problems are getting worse, but the solutions are getting better. And it's important to realize that both of those things are true. So I'll go to the next slide. One of the things that I focus on in my classes, and I think maybe I've made these points even too well, is if we go to the next part of the slide, that energy transitions are hard for three big reasons. First, we all want energy that's clean, that's cheap, and that's reliable, but we often disagree deeply about which of those is most important. The second difficult thing is if we look in the past, transitions from one major energy carrier to another take decades, like 70 years to go from a coal-based economy to an oil one. And third, if you think about climate change in particular, CO2 stays in the atmosphere on average for 100 years. That's really different from pollutants that we've dealt with in the past, when you stop emitting them, they rain out of the sky in a week or two. So for those reasons, there's a lot of urgency to do something about it, and also patience in terms of the payoffs to our investments. On the next slide, this is a slide I've put together because I realized I did such a good job on that first slide to my students that they only understood that it would seem like a daunting challenge. But there really are reasons to be optimistic about what's happening now. And if you scroll to the next point, the number one reason, that's the one I'll talk about tonight, is that technology is improving, and it really underlies a lot of the other issues that are happening here about learning from policy and about collective action. It's really that technology is changing. And let me illustrate that with the next slide. This is a slide that, so Mike mentioned, I served as a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's an interesting process, hundreds of scientists working together over years to put together a giant report. The real key to that report, though, is a 30-page summary that actually has to get approved by members of individual countries. And so I spent my spring break last spring negotiating with other countries, especially large oil producing countries, about making sure that the text that we wrote would be acceptable to them because they had to approve it. And in some cases, we could change the text to accommodate concerns that we had left out. And in other cases, we had to say, this is what the science says, and this needs to be in the report. And this picture is one of those. This is something that I worked on for years, and it's been really satisfying to see it get elevated to the summary for policymakers. But part of the reason that it was a struggle to get it put forward is that it's good news. The cost of solar has come down by 90% in the last 10 years, and wind has come down as well. Offshore wind has come down even more. Batteries for electric vehicles have come down even more than solar. And so this makes such a difference. And so that these key technologies now are able to compete with fossil fuels without subsidies and provide a means to decarbonize our energy system that is affordable, that is reliable, and is clean. Next slide. And not only are the costs coming down, but they're getting rapidly adopted. So we now have solar at 3% of global electricity supply, about 4% in the US. That sounds like small numbers, but look at that curve. That's exponential growth. That's a technology growing at 20% a year. And a technology that's at 4% today, that's growing at 20%, will account for 100% of electricity supply by 2040. So don't see the 3% and think that's small. This is something that's growing quickly, and it's quickly becoming a really important technology. Wind is a good complement to solar, and then batteries for electric vehicles is transformative. One, because the batteries allow solar and wind to provide power when it's not sunny and windy. And two, it allows us to electrify transportation so that we're not completely dependent on oil. And we've seen the issues that's raised in 1973, 1979, and 2022. So big change is happening. Next slide. One of the things that I've really focused on in my work is to understand not just that these changes are happening, but how they have happened and why they have happened. And was the focus on the book that Mike mentioned, How Solar Energy Became Cheap, from a few years ago. It's become, I don't know, I've gotten a lot of attention on the book, I think in part because people realize this is a really important change, and understanding how it happened gives us a playbook. It gives us a way to say, okay, if we want electric vehicles to come down in price the same way solar has, would some of these same things apply? If we want a hydrogen-based economy, or at least part of our economy running on hydrogen, how could we learn from solar? And that's what this book is about. I'm going to be talking about it at the IMF in DC on Thursday. And it's been gratifying to find such an audience for academic work. Next slide, please. So this is, if I had to boil down the book into one picture, this would be it. So first of all, over this long period of 70 years, from Einstein's Nobel Prize winning work on photoelectric effect, not on relativity, on photoelectric effect, we've had a factor of 10,000, that's a 10 to the minus fourth, reduction in the cost of solar. And so that meant that a household today uses about 1 megawatt hour of electricity for a single family home. That would have cost, in 1958, $300,000 a month to power your home with the cells on that satellite. And in a large sunny location at a large scale installation today, we're talking about $20 for that megawatt hour. And it's been steady incremental progress over 60 years. No one country did it. If I had to summarize the contributions, I would say the US created a technology, the Germans created a market for it, and the Chinese made it cheap. And it was this global innovation system with people moving around the world, money moving around the world, machines moving around the world, expertise embodied in tacit knowledge of people's heads, going from one country to another, and that continues to happen today. So that's been the story with solar. Next slide. But the one problem with the solar story is that even though it's been such success, it took too long. If we wanted to do the same thing for other technologies, we have to go faster. If we needed to get a technology that would remove CO2 that's already in the air, called direct air capture, and get that to low cost by 2040 and be widespread adoption by mid-century, we have to go faster, and not just faster, 4 times faster. And that, to put it in perspective, we've seen that in other areas. We've seen that with the COVID-19 vaccine, where we had Operation Warp Speed, combination of R&D funding as well as market commitments, led to development of vaccine that was 4 times faster than the world record, the measles vaccine, which took 4 years, then we did it in 1 year. So that's what we need to do with future technologies. Next slide. So that's really about what my work at UW here now is about, is how can we speed up innovation and get outcomes like we have with solar, but do it in a faster timeline so it's relevant to the energy problems we face today. And a lot of that is looking at the past, looking at how technologies have scaled up in the past. And on one hand, you might say, well, things are going faster now, and it does look similar. And we see the fastest rates are for COVID-19 vaccinations and e-bikes in Europe. But also very fast are things that happened on a wartime mentality in the 1940s, where we built Liberty ships and aircraft at very fast rates of production. And that illustrates it's not just the technology that we have today, the general purpose technologies like information technology and globalization. It's also this commitment and focus of resources and broad consensus that we need to do something quickly. And if we have that directed to energy problems, and we have the global economy and the communications network and the general purpose technologies we have today, there is a reason we could do things a lot faster than we have in the past. Next slide. This slide is probably a bit much detail, but this is kind of the scope of our work here. These are 100 different technologies in different sectors that we're looking at, understanding why they've gone fast or why they've gone slow. And just to show, the last slide is a comparison of these technologies, and we've grouped them into slow technologies. These are things like infrastructure, building pipelines, building railroads on the left, and technologies on the right, digitalization technologies like internet hosts and broadband access and smartphones. All of those move really quickly. And then we've got technologies in the middle. So a key here is how can we match the technologies of our targets, what we want to do in the future, to some of the historical antecedents, and learn from those and find ways to spur technology so that we can address energy innovation and get energy that is cheap, that is clean, and that is reliable. And so that becomes the consensus, and innovation is really the way we get to achieve all of those goals for the energy transition. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, that was a great setup for the program, Greg. You gave us a big tour of energy transitions and kind of opened the door, I think, for a lot of audience questions. So we'll come back to you in a bit. Our next speaker is Lena Roald, an assistant professor of electrical and computer engineering and a Granger Institute fellow. Her research focuses on modeling and optimization of energy systems to ensure reliable grid operations as renewable sources such as solar and wind replace traditional forms of generation such as coal and nuclear. Her group is developing mathematical tools and software implementations to optimize system operation and energy markets while taking into account the impact of uncertain events, such as variations in renewable energy production, one of the criticisms of that source, right? Component failures and large-scale outages. So, Lena, I look forward to you telling us a little bit about more of the microstructure of how this power gets delivered.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. And that's definitely the angle that I am thinking about energy through. So I put here on my slide just a short introduction of the kind of work that we are doing in my group. So as Mike mentioned, I'm in the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. So I'm an engineer. I come at this sort of from a technical perspective. And we are looking at things like, for example, electric lines or windmills or wind turbines or solar panels as technologies that help us run the electric grid. And so there's many components out there, that are needed in order to create electricity and bring it to our homes. And in order to achieve that, we have this huge, enormous infrastructure called the electric grid. And I'm sure all of you have seen electric grid infrastructure, maybe more than you like. So I've put a couple of photos here on the slide taken by students in my class, and also a visualization of all the electric transmission lines in the US transmission grid, created also by a student in my group, who are, and these pictures are, I encourage my students to go out and actually look around and notice how pervasive and everywhere this electric grid infrastructure is, and how important it is in our day-to-day lives. And so essentially what I will be talking about here a little bit is how these individual pieces, like for example, wind turbines and individual power lines, make up this really big system that help us provide electricity to people when they need it and where they need it. And then, of course, I'm also going to talk about some of the challenges and link to what Professor Gregory Nemet was also just describing here. So if I can have the next slide, please. Yeah, so since we're going to talk about the future of energy here, I also thought that it can be helpful to start from a little bit of a perspective of history. So electricity has only been around since around 1880, and the first sort of era of electricity generation and transmission and distribution was really just about making it work. And Wisconsin actually has a special place in that making it work part by actually installing one of the world's first commercial power plants, and in particular, the first hydroelectric commercial power plant ever installed in the world. And so this is from Appleton, Wisconsin, a picture. Next slide, please. So after we had been able to make the system start working, and we had these small plants that were, providing power maybe to a few houses, mostly for lighting, it became apparent that electricity is really, really helpful for a lot of different things. And so in the period from around 1920 to around 2000, it really became important to try and make electricity both affordable and accessible, essentially everywhere and to everyone. And so we saw some of the cost curves for solar and wind in Professor Nemet's slides. Here is an earlier cost curve that also shows how much, kind of just demonstrates how much the cost of electricity increased over this period of time, starting from around 1920, and how that really increased people's consumption of electricity. And then at the same time, we went from having these small local grids to getting this really large scale infrastructure that stretches essentially coast to coast. And so that is what you can see, again, this picture of the US transmission grid as it is today on the right here of the slide. Okay, so this electricity became so pervasive and proved to be so useful for so many different things that the National Academy of Engineering, when considering what was the greatest engineering achievements of the 20th century, put electrification first. So this has really been, and this is because electricity and electrification of society has really been the underpinning that has allowed us to do a whole lot of different things. If you think about it, you use electricity at almost every point in your day-to-day life, right? I mean, it goes from powering your fridge to having on your light. It plays an important role in your heating, in your cooling. If you use a computer, a phone, there's many things we could just not have if we didn't have electricity. So next slide, please. So since we have come to rely so much on electricity, what we are seeing now is that it is becoming more and more important to make it sustainable. And I would sort of say that that is kind of a currently ongoing era of electricity production, is to really allow for sustainable energy generation. And so Professor Nemet talked about solar energy. We also have wind energy, which has been really increasing very rapidly. And the slide here on the right, there's a graphic that essentially tries to demonstrate just how much renewable energy is getting added to the grid. And you can notice here, so yellow and green is solar and wind, and blue is natural gas. And so essentially we have, over the past decade or two, really been replacing more dirty fuels like coal with renewable generation. And today, renewable generation from wind, solar, and hydropower account for approximately the same amount of electricity production in the United States as coal does. So this has been a huge change, and it's very rapidly ongoing, as also Professor Nemet pointed out. So next slide, please. So now I've been talking about the history of electricity. So then, of course, here we are to talk about the future. And it's natural to ask, what's next and what are we doing in order to try and help this happen? So one of the things that we are definitely seeing is that we will have even more renewable energy. So already mentioned earlier, this is because renewable energy is actually becoming both a cheap and a clean alternative. And it's also abundant. We can find sun and wind at many different locations. However, there are also some significant challenges with renewable energy. And one of the most important ones is that it is not always available where and when we need it. So on this map here, which is admittedly quite small, you could notice that there is the new installation of wind energy is sort of centered in the middle of the country. Whereas the original generation that it is replacing is typically located closer to the coast and closer to large population centers. So this demonstrates that in order to achieve this energy transition, we not only have to build out renewable energy, but we also have to think about where we are going to build new power lines and new infrastructure to transport this electricity from where we need it, where it can be generated to where it is needed by people. Another aspect of this is also that it has to match in time. For example, we don't have sun in the night. So if you need electricity at night, you still have to have an alternative. So that is where storage comes in. However, we are also increasingly seeing that there can be differences between seasons. For example, today here in Madison, it's been snowing. So even during the day, you could definitely not expect to get a lot of electricity from your solar panel if you had one on the roof, because it would have been covered in snow. At the same time, you might have been needing more electricity to power your house or to do to keep, for example, the fans of your heating system running. And so therefore, there is this mismatch between not having access to renewable energy or when you might have access to renewable energy and when you actually need the electricity. So if you can go, so that's some of the challenges with renewable energy. At the same time, we are seeing this very large scale and rapid transition towards new electricity uses. And so, for example, we are expecting a large increase in the amount of electric vehicles on the roads. And that has to be, the electricity that is going to power those cars has to come from somewhere. So while it is really beneficial to be able to replace more dirty sources of energy, such as petroleum, with electricity from clean sources, this also increases demand and also potentially strain on the whole electricity system. And you could also think about a future in which we might have much hotter weather and where air conditioning is becoming increasingly more important for people to remain healthy and safe during heat waves. And so if you then lose, for example, access to electricity during that period of time, it could actually become a matter of your health or even life or death for people to get that electricity back. And so these are things that we are very concerned about, and we want to make sure that as we are enabling these new uses for electricity, that we also take into account that the impact of power outages might be even higher in the future. And so next slide, please. And in particular, one of our ongoing very strong research focuses in that space is that we are also seeing an increased amount of extreme weather, increasing frequency, increasing severity. And so this can be a range of different weather and at different time scales. So you can have, for example, extreme heat waves or cold spells. Where you, for example, could have a blackout like the one that we experienced in Texas in February in 2021. There were several million people who lost power due to a very large cold spell. We are seeing more severe storms that can literally come through and break down electricity poles. Another example is the higher wildfire risk that is in many parts of the country, and which is also particularly a research focus that we are interested in my group, is how electric power systems and the electric lines both contribute to start fires, but also can be burned down by fires. And so you have these new interactions that we have to account for as we go ahead and try and design those systems in order to be able to withstand those kind of new weather conditions. And those at slightly longer timescales, we also have to think about things like droughts, for example, which impact, for example, hydroelectric generation, which requires precipitation in order to be running. And so there is this whole range of things that can happen due to this more extreme weather, and it's becoming increasingly critical that we are thinking about how to manage the impacts of those extreme weather so that we are able to continue to provide electricity to people when they might be needing it the most. And so this is really kind of a core research focus of our group. And so essentially I wanted to end this by saying, it's not all doom and gloom. Of course, it is very encouraging that we are seeing the technology around renewable energy growing. It's becoming better, it is becoming cheaper, it is more available. And so, there are really many things to be happy about here. There is actually a lot of things that we can do also as individuals to contribute to making these energy transitions, and in particular for the electric grid to work better. And that is during more extreme weather, for example. We have utilities go out and ask the public to, for example, conserve energy. And by heeding such warnings and trying to kind of help the electric grid a little bit from time to time, we can really also help ease some of those impacts that I just mentioned. All right, so thank you.
Well, thank you, Lena. That was a great presentation, and we'll come back to you shortly with questions after our final guest. And our final guest is Tim Donahue, the Ira L. Baldwin Professor of Bacteriology and the UW Foundation Fetzer Bascom Professor at UW-Madison. He's also the director of the Wisconsin Energy Institute, an internationally recognized expert on bio and genome-based conversion of renewable resources into valuable products, past president and current secretary of the American Society for Microbiology, the oldest and largest biological sciences professional society in the country. And he's an honorary fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Academy of Microbiology, and has served on numerous federal and international advisory panels and led large federally funded cross-disciplinary graduate training programs. Since 2007, he's been the principal investigator and director of Great Lakes Bioenergy, a renewable fuels and chemical research center funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Science, right near our home headquarters of the UW Foundation. And so I get to pop down and see Tim from time to time. So Tim, please share your insights with us, and then we'll come back for Q&A with the whole group.
Thanks, Mike. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. And I'm sure some people on the call are probably saying, what the heck is a biologist or a microbiologist doing on a session that's focused on the future of energy? And I think a take-home message is that this is a grand societal challenge. And one way to meet this challenge is to think about a diverse set of approaches to help us provide everything that we need from fossil fuels today. And so instead of thinking about it as an either or, we should be thinking about it as a little bit of everything. And instead of thinking about it as who's going to be the winner, we need to think about what winners are out there. So I thought I would take a few minutes to just talk about the Wisconsin Energy Institute. Here's a picture of it. As Mike said, it's right down the street from the Foundation building. And this is a cross-campus institute with a goal of being a catalyst to move the campus forward in energy. So as I've just said, energy is a very diverse issue and challenge for us. And Greg and Lena just did a great job talking about what we can do for stationary and some of the transport needs in terms of electric vehicles. But I want to highlight the idea that there are research activities that are needed for success in the transport space about fuels, vehicles, and engines that are probably never going to run, or at least not in my lifetime, on electricity, and renewable products that we get from fossil fuels that we want to decarbonize. So if you were sitting next to me on a plane and asked me what I do, I would probably describe myself as a green microbiologist, someone who thinks about how biology can make renewable products, and differentiate myself from a dark side microbiologist who I'd like to tease my friends in the medical school, deal with large problems that have kept us in bubbles for the last 2 years with a pandemic. And one of the great things about UW-Madison and the Energy Institute is that its technical experts get to collaborate with people all over campus on policy, economics, and societal impact, people like Greg and others that you've already heard from. So to give you an idea of where Bucky sits in the energy landscape, I threw this next slide up, which shows where UW-Madison gets its energy research support. If this was a quiz, you might immediately think of the Department of Energy, and we are the second largest university recipient of funding from their Office of Science, which is their basic science academic wing. But there is also funding, significant funding here from NSF, the Department of Agriculture, the Defense Department, and a variety of interagency programs. When you add that all up, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that energy research, to the extent that I can track it, accounts for well over $200 million a year on campus, which is about 20% of our research portfolio. And that's split out in these 5 colleges. For those of you who are alumni, hopefully you see a home there, and the Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Education. That's the home administrative unit of the Wisconsin Energy Institute. So one thing I want to leave you with today also is an idea that UW-Madison is a land-grant university that's built to tackle this energy challenge, meeting the growing need around climate, energy, greenhouse gases, economy, and training leaders in the workforce for tomorrow, but also providing the U.S. and Wisconsin with competitive advantages in new markets for their products. So let me give you a couple of examples. So this is a nice green slide that talks about how we could make renewable energy a reality and grow what is becoming very popular, being referred to as a low carbon economy. We've already heard about wind and solar and hydro, and my activity is over in the left part of this nice green picture, a circle all around using different crops or plants purposely designed and grown to be used as a source of energy, processing those materials, sending them to a biorefinery, and making fuels and chemicals that we currently depend on from fossil fuels out of green renewable resources. So to say 1 or 2 words about energy crops, I want to stress this is not food, corn. This is things like wood chips, forestry, switchgrass, responsibly harvested prairies. And these are crops that have a lower energy footprint. So Greg mentioned that he was on the IPCC writing team that developed solutions to help us reduce climate, the temperature of the planet. And most of their successful models call for radical changes in agriculture to decrease our dependence on pesticides and fertilizer as very energy intensive compounds that also produce a lot of greenhouse gases. So in Great Lakes Bioenergy and the Energy Institute, we have a lot of research on what those cropping systems look like, where they could be deployed, and how they could be used responsibly. We also have a lot of activities on next generation processes to make products that have a lower carbon footprint. So let's talk about that a little bit on the next slide, using biorefineries. So if you look over on the left here in the blue box, you see today's industries: agriculture, dairy products, food, beverages, biofuels, ethanol, maybe even biodiesel, forestry. And you look over on the right, we can see the industries of tomorrow, where we can see fermentation by microbes producing bio-based substitutes for chemicals plastics, materials, aviation fuels, renewable natural gas, all sorts of products from abundant residues. But to connect those, we are a research leader in what I have in the middle of enabling technologies using genomics and synthetic biology and precision microbial engineering and automation and machine learning to take the industries from the left over to where they need to be on the right. So we are already, for example, making hydrocarbons from non-food biomass that are adaptable to go into aviation fuel at a very low level. So let me give you another example. If I go to the next slide, as we've been talking about making products from renewable crops, another major industry in the state, namely in the Midwest, the dairy industry has actually approached us about technology that we could deploy to allow them to take residues that are left over from making milk, cheese, and other dairy products like yogurt and convert them into high-value chemicals. So, for example, if you're going to make yogurt, for every pound of yogurt that you make, you're left with 8 pounds of whey. And that material is not used for anything of value. But we are now converting that into valuable chemicals to replace chemicals that currently come from fossil fuels. The vision is that someday that biorefinery up in the upper left-hand corner could be one that's fed by crops that are grown specially for that purpose, or it could be one that's also fed by the leftover materials from dairy residues that currently are not part of the economic bottom line for that major industry in the state and around the United States. So let me go to the next slide, which is one that illustrates a point I've made. We are rich in organic residues in the United States. You've seen this map before with the electric grid on it. This is my version of the map, colorized to show the abundance of organic residues that are localized around the country. Dark blue is the most abundant. Green is the agricultural Midwest. That's leftover organic residues from dairy and cropping systems. If you add that all up in the chart on the left, by fermentation, that's a multi-billion gallon yearly output of fuel or chemicals that we can make if we can develop the technologies that are robust and resilient to convert those organic materials into chemicals. So we see a lot of potential for that. In the next slide, to be used as renewable sources of transportation fuels, hydrocarbons, not ethanol, but hydrocarbons that can go into cars if we're still going to be running them on gasoline, jets, or shipping and naval, renewable natural gas, as well as things like heat and consumer and industrial products. I want you to focus your attention, if you will, on the green barrel of oil on the upper right-hand side of this slide. I've colorized that to be green to say in the future when we can make those products in the slices, 50% of those products, 50% of the profit from that green barrel will be in fuels. And that's about 75% of the volume. The other 50% will be in the yellow slice on the top, which is chemicals. That will mimic what the petrochemical industry does today in making products. This is not a popular thing to say today, but gasoline is one of the high volume, low cost per unit products of petrochemical refining. It's the chemicals that make the money that keep jet, diesel, and gasoline as cheap as it is around the world. And if we achieve this, we can do it in a way that captures CO2, reduces it, and makes these products in a green, renewable way. So moving on to my last slide, I want to leave you with the fact that we're here, all of us in this session tonight, to energize the Wisconsin idea. And if we do this right, it can lower greenhouse gas emission, reduce abundant resources, make new cost-competitive products, expand economic opportunity to underserved regions and people. Let's make these products in Wisconsin and the North Central agricultural region of the US, or all around the country and the world, depending on where you are, instead of making them only in a limited number of sites. And this is also a multi-trillion-dollar a year industry, which has the potential to create over 1 billion jobs and put those jobs in areas that haven't benefited from the traditional energy sector today. So with that, I'm going to end and pass it back to Mike and let him take over from here.
Great. Thank you, Tim. What a great program tonight. I really appreciate all of your views. And I also want to thank our audience. We've had a very lively comment feed out there and people with some really hard-hitting questions. So, you know, at the core of all this, I think a lot of people wonder, you know, we hear that renewables are getting cheaper, and in some cases they're cheaper than fossil fuels, yet you know, Timothy Carr observed in the chat that it seems like the states that use a lot of renewables or the countries that use a lot of renewables have pretty high electricity costs, although that could be for other reasons, could be taxes. I'm not sure. But what I wonder about is, do a lot of these renewable sources, do they really scale on the production and distribution side well enough? You know, because they require their own raw materials. And in some cases, I mean, are these raw materials that might be in limited supply? Are we going to have trouble making enough lithium batteries because there isn't enough of the raw materials for that? Can people address the scalability of some of the various renewable options that we have? And I don't know if that's a question more for Greg or Tim or Lena. I'm not sure, but maybe I'll start with Greg.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it because that's been my career. I was taught in grad school that energy is a big system. Climate change is the biggest environmental problem there is. And so you need big technologies to deal with big problems. And if you are talking about solar or wind or batteries, you're messing around the edges and you're just not being serious. And my thinking has completely changed on that, because if you look at all the data, it's become really clear that small technologies grow faster than large technologies, and they fall in cost faster than large technologies. So counterintuitively, it really does seem like small technologies are more scalable than large ones are. And of course, all of this requires materials and mining, and in some cases, exotic materials that aren't much of, like cobalt and lithium. In some cases, materials that are abundant and plentiful, like silicon for solar panels, but it's different materials. But I was just doing this in class today. You know, in a lot of ways, those materials kind of give us some of the same issues that we have with fossil fuels. We have, you know, booms of overinvestment that depress prices, and then underinvestment when prices are low. And so you wouldn't expect these materials to have steady or even gradually increasing prices. It'll be boom and bust all the way through, just like fossil fuels. But the consequences are much lower, because with fuels, if you get cut off, if you're trying to heat your house in Germany right now, or if you are trying to fuel your car in 1973 in the US, you have problems right away. If the price of lithium goes up and you've got an electric vehicle, you don't care until you buy your next electric vehicle. So the consequences of shortage are much more dampened, and they're much less susceptible to political and geopolitical manipulation like we've seen in the Middle East in the 1970s and from Russia today. So I think the issues are there, but they're not as troublesome as they have been in the past.
Lena?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is also, maybe just to add to that, you know, on the electricity side, you can say that, like, you know, say 10 years ago, people were saying, oh, the grid can at most have 20% renewables on it. Otherwise, it is going to break because of all these effects that then changes when you go from like large generators to these like many distributed and smaller facilities. And guess what? Like these days, there are many parts of the world which regularly reach, the US as a whole is getting 20% of energy from electricity from renewable on a year basis. California just hit 100% renewable energy, and they were actually exporting also other low carbon energy sources like nuclear during that period of time. In spring, in April, they had their first hitting 100% no carbon energy. And also in a place like California, I think is an interesting example, because most of the most rapid growth that we see there in terms of solar installations is really people putting solar panels on their roof. And so there is really this trend that the addition of very many small things and small installations actually really add up to change the bigger picture. So definitely it does scale, and maybe more so than adapting a lot of outside land to put solar panels on. So
do we get most of our solar panels from China, and is that a problem?
Yeah, we do. It hasn't been a problem. China has really done tremendous innovation on incrementally reducing the price through automation, mass manufacturing, tremendous ambition and scale, global supply chains, integrating a supply chain. So it's incredible what's happened with China. And I guess the concern is they're going to not sell us solar panels anymore because they want to cut down our growth. I guess that's a threat, but as a result, we have domestic manufacturing beginning in the US. There's a company called First Solar that's been around for 20 years doing that. And the Inflation Reduction Act has $60 billion to subsidize domestic manufacturing for clean energy. So I think what we could do is just have a credible threat of creating a solar industry or an electric vehicle industry or wind power or other industries. And that's enough to keep a country like China from cutting us off. But, if I were China, I'd be much more worried about Vietnam and Malaysia and other places developing their own clean energy manufacturing, because there's no reason it has to stay in China.
Right. Yeah. And I wasn't necessarily thinking they would cut us off, but we might cut off our nose to spite our face, which we're pretty good at too. Trade policy. So I'm mostly a free trader, but I know we've had a lot of tension growing with China in the technology space, and I guess it was encouraging that Biden and Xi seemed to have a productive meeting yesterday. So maybe we can get back on side a little bit. Tim Donahue, I'm going to throw a question to you from Timothy Carr. How much land will be required to power the grid with renewables? And Lena, you may chime in on this too. Tim says the studies he's seen have very large acreages per megawatt hour, and this number hasn't changed significantly in his estimation. What do we know about that? So that's another issue, is how much land is consumed by moving to renewables. And
so I don't have an answer for how much would you need to power the grid. I'll let Lena wrap her head around that one, and Greg. But I will say in Great Lakes Bioenergy and the DOE program that we're part of, there is over 1 billion tons of non-food crops grown on existing land in the United States every year that's potentially harvestable and convertible into fuels and chemicals. Success would be able to replace 30% of the fossil fuels that we use in the transportation sector. I want to make it clear, 30%, not 100%. 1 out of every 3 barrels. We don't have the biomass resources to get those other 2 out of 3. That's because that's a big number, right? And that's land that's currently used to grow crops, to grow plants, whether it's native prairie or trees. Sometimes those trees aren't thinned out enough. Our friends in the Forest Service down the lab would say we would have less forest fires if we were allowed to thin the forest in the way that the ecologists say we should thin them, because then you would have less tree to tree spread. Why not do that and convert it to economic opportunity in the Upper Peninsula, in Wisconsin, in the Great Northwest, in the Southeast? There's a lot of renewable resources there. It's how you responsibly and sustainably tap into them in the future. That's what I mean when I say if we do it right.
Yeah. Lena, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, on the land use for renewable energy, certainly that is a concern, and there are different, it's a question. Like there are many, and this is a question that is increasingly being raised, and we also see it here in Wisconsin, right, where there are wind projects, for example, that are being developed partially on agricultural land. The benefit to that is that there is space between the wind turbines that you can still use for agriculture. There is currently also research going into understanding what is called agrovoltaics, which is kind of the multi-use of land, where you could have solar panels and also grow crops or some kind of plants. Maybe that would be biomass rather than food. But how can you actually kind of multiplex and use the land for multiple things? But I think it is a concern, and it will change the landscape. It can change how things look. And so that there is, and that can happen at the scale, which can be uncomfortable for people who live there, or if they are not properly involved in the processes. On the other hand, renewable build out also has the opportunity to bring jobs. It has the opportunity to bring revenue. It is important for the energy transition and for our transition to a more sustainable energy supply. And so I think there are many people that grapple with this. I've talked to caller-ins on shows before who have been telling the story of like how they are seeing their family farmland being converted to a solar farm, and how they feel very ambiguous about it, because there will no longer be crops grown on that farmland, but there will now be solar energy being generated, which they see as a positive. And I think that's the way it is. There is a lot of trade-offs that we are facing. So maybe it's nicer that it is a solar farm than a parking lot. But we can think about, and this is why it's also nice to be able to use, for example, rooftops to put solar panels on them, because they might not be used very much otherwise, right? So,
Greg, did you want to chime in on this? And, are there any negative externalities with some of the renewables use that we just haven't quite experienced yet because we're not at scale?
I guess competition for materials, land use is an issue. But I think these are not big ones. Like, we have had lots of land use issues that we've dealt with. I think probably the trickiest thing is going to be, to make renewables really work well, we're going to have to build a lot of electric transmission around. I mean, Lena's already talked about that. Mm-hmm. But that's creates a lot of opposition when we expand existing lines and create new ones. So finding ways to make that work in a way that people in those communities are supportive of it, that's going to be a big challenge. It's not so much about the economics of it. It's more about the public acceptance of more.
Yeah, and Mike, to riff off of what Greg just said, if you think about my vision, where we're going to have these biorefineries strategically placed all around the country. Well, so we've modeled over 9 million acres in the north central region of the United States, and we think we could site 3 to 4 dozen of those at reasonably scalable size. Cost a couple of $100 million just to build and turn the lights on. But you need, as Lena said, you need infrastructure to bring the materials in. You need jobs and people to work in that refinery and make the products, the chemicals and fuels, and you need infrastructure to take it out. Is it a pipeline? Is it rail lines? What are the communities going to say when you give them the beauty of jobs and money, but rail lines and a refinery and da-da-da-da-da? So there's no free lunch here. We have to decide what our priorities are. Greg really, I think, hit it out of the park when he talked about how rapid things changed, and he talked about the COVID vaccines. Well, there you had a technology that was waiting, and society pulled it. Right?
Yeah.
Will there be a societal imperative to pull renewables so that it grows that fast? If not, and it just happens organically, it'll take a long time. I'm not saying we need an ecological disaster to pull like
Right.
COVID did for vaccines, but there's a clear example of where society pulled that technology to have it come out really fast.
Yeah. That was, maybe more obvious life or death that
Right.
everyone in the country could kind of feel. This is a little different, but let's not go down that rabbit hole of how effective our political system is just now. Nancy Shonke asks about nuclear energy. We haven't talked a lot about that. Many people feel like that's a technology that's proven. It's got, the capacity to deliver a fair amount of energy quickly and at high quality. What do you all think about the role of nuclear energy in the energy transition? Lena?
Yeah, well, so it is a low carbon alternative, right? That is great. That it's a possibility to reduce emissions. It is a proven technology. It can generate a lot of energy, at scale. Of course, there are the long-standing issues of nuclear that we still don't have any good way of dealing with the fuel. There is no final deposit for fuel in the United States, even after that has been, a target for a very long time to create. And there is, of course, the very significant risks of nuclear meltdowns. And I will just point to one thing. So there are different countries have taken very, very different approaches to this, right? We have in Europe, in particular, you have seen Germany essentially just leave nuclear. Because of the aforementioned concerns. But then at the same time, we have the neighboring country, France, which is really, a very big nuclear nation. And one of the challenges, so there are some challenges in particular in this energy transition where current nuclear power plants are not very flexible. They are not very good at ramping up their energy production or down, which makes them not so good running mates, if you want, with renewable energy. So they are not very well suited for balancing out a variability in renewable energy supply. That is one challenge. I know that there is research that is ongoing in order to try and address that, to make it more flexible and also build smaller nuclear power plants that could be more distributed. But then when it comes to security risk, because we are very concerned about security around nuclear power, it is very, very expensive to build. It is more expensive than renewables. There is also, just to kind of highlight, actually, you have mentioned Europe before and the kind of challenges that are being faced there. We know of because of reliance on Russian gas. There is actually in France this year, they had a situation where they had to go and check most of their nuclear power plants for cracks. So in one of the containments on the primary circuits of these nuclear power plants, they found cracks. And they have to stop every nuclear power plant, get into that super radioactive space to look at if they are having damage. If they have damage there, they have to stop the plant, do repairs, and then run it back up again. And this is actually a cause this is actually a situation which could cause it could also be a contribution to very large-scale power blackouts and outages in France this winter if they don't get that fixed on time. And so, it's not something we talk about as much because it is not directly related to Russia, but it is, again, if you put a lot of your bets in one technology, you can end up with these kind of situations where you then have a vulnerability. And now, of course, you can say, okay, but what if nuclear is part of a mix? There could be renewables and nuclear, and I personally think that it is a good idea. I don't to pursue some nuclear and consider that as an option, but there are also clear disadvantages to it and things that one has to weigh very carefully if choosing to go that route.
We are at the top of the hour. Usually I feel obligated to let my guests go when we've run out of time. We've got a few questions that I think are really good questions, and maybe we'll throw them at you and we'll try to feed them back into the chat at our next program for people. But I just want to thank you all for taking time out of your schedule to be with us tonight. This was a very insightful program, very interesting. Tim, I appreciate the fact that you're going to make jet fuel from renewables, but I'd rather put it in boats and cars, just to be honest. I'm not ready for that in my planes just yet. But thank you all for being here tonight. It's a great program, and I'm sure we'll have you back again at some point, and maybe we'll get you together for an in-person program soon.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
All right. And thanks to our audience. Great questions and commentary tonight. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of it, but really lively audience, and I think a really good program by our faculty. Right now, we're planning to be back on December 13th with our predictions show. We're going to have people on from different areas to offer their predictions about U.S. politics, geopolitics, the economy, and markets. I think that promises to be a lot of fun. And you never know, we might surprise you with a show before then on the 29th of November. Who knows? But we'll be back soon, and we'll get this going with more regularity in 2023. I promise you that. Thanks to our audience. You guys have been great, and we'll see you again next week on Wisconsin.
Welcome to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, purveyor of Midwestern values. Values like a hard day's work, lending a helping hand, being a friendly neighbor, spending time with family, staying close to home, enjoying the simpler things in life, and living with integrity. It's these values that make a Badger unstoppable.